we'll get going. Session 9, almost there. Passage planning. Okay, so guys, what I'm not going to do this week is literally do a passage plan for you. What we're talking about is passage planning as a general topic, and then how and what we put into passage planning, not literally putting pencil to paper and saying, okay, this is how you exit, this is how you enter report. Those are specific topics. So passage planning is actually a culmination of tidal streams, tidal calculations, all of those things when you're putting pencil to paper, okay? But what I'm going to talk about is what we think about if you're just going to cross the channel or if you're going to cross the Atlantic, you know, all those sort of topics that potential skippers would need to know and make a list of before going to sea, whether it's just for a day or for an entire crossing. So what goes into a passage plan? Basic pilotage. Now, basic pilotage as a whole is getting in and out of ports. So basic pilotage and what we'd think about there. Navigational considerations. Victualling. Obviously, for those who don't know the word victualling, it basically means what we put on board. Safe haven considerations. So if you're doing a trip, you want to have safe havens. And a safe haven is basically, it's not part of your route, it's where you would stop if something happened. And then keeping a navigational log. Okay, we're not going to cover, as I said, how to write and calculate one. It's impossible for us to literally do a passage plan. My average passage plan, just the written side of it, I'm talking about working out tidal port calculations, etc., can take 3 to 4 hours just to write the first half of it. It's usually, the clipper ones take us about 6 to 8 hours to write. So it's not something we can do in an hour. Okay, so basic ideas passage plan. What is a passage plan? What will we be looking at as a passage plan? It's planning a passage, or a voyage planning is a procedure to develop a complete description of the vessel's voyage from start to finish before you go. That's the big trick. How you get in and out, what's going to happen when you're out there, what can you do for emergencies, how much stores do I need, etc., etc., etc. It's basically doing your entire trip before you leave. Okay, so this includes leaving the dock and or harbor area. So if your dock's in a harbor, you've got to get out of there. The en route portion of your passage, and then the approach and the destination and where you're mooring at the end. So all these things have got to be thought of before you go. It also includes victualling. Okay, and as I said, victualling is everything you want to put on board. Water, fuel, food, clothing, spares, first aid, emergency aid, bedding, etc., 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 etc. All the things you put on board. I mean, depending on what type of sailing you're doing, that list can keep going. Okay. And then the crew, who are you taking with you? That's also part of your plan. The ability of your crew, the age, have you got a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old on board? The gender, okay? Do you need, have you got all boys, or do you need to make sure you've got facilities for girls? And that's not being sexist for the ladies out there. It's like, you know, you might want somewhere to change. You know, if you're on a boat with an open plan deck below, you've got to think about it. The seaworthiness of your crew. Are they liable to suffer from seasickness? You know? And then watch systems. What are you going to do with your crew once they're on board? These are all things that go into a passage plan. Okay? So to start with, I thought, well, let's leave the port. So pilotage. Okay? Pilotage is navigation where you can bump into things. If you're in the middle of the Atlantic, you wouldn't be piloting, you'd just be doing nav. So pilotage is specifically where you can bump into things. Okay, so that's knowing where and when you can make safe passage in and out of ports. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. Have you got the tide? Have you got the wind? Is it safe? Is it too much traffic, etc.? And along coastal coastlines. A lot of that can be pilotage. And obviously into any safe havens or just going back into a port. Okay, so factors that we take into account. The first thing a pilotage is you want to have it accessed on deck. So you will have notes scribbled. You don't want to be running up and down in a harbor trying to navigate. You want to have it pre-done neatly so you can literally stand on deck and go out knowing everything. So the first thing you take into account is your tide. If you think of ports like St. Peter Port in the Isle of Jersey, there's a bar there, okay, that stops you getting in and out at low water. So can you get in and out? What times can you get in and out? Okay, your tide must be included in your passage plan. Okay, the other thought is your tidal stream. Okay, your tidal stream, sorry, I'll go back one. Your tidal stream is, are you going against the tide when leaving port, or are you coming into the tide when leaving port? If you're going against it, you're going to do half the speed. If you're going with it, you're going to shoot out of a port quite quickly. So you want to know these factors. Is it a very dense traffic harbor? Okay, so are you going to be sitting in a corner waiting while there's lots of boats moving? I don't know if any of you have ever seen the Medina River when it's busy. And the Medina River goes into Cowes on the Isle of Wight. When that's busy, you can sit and wait half an hour just to cross it. So you want to know what the density is like and what's going on. This is a stock photo that I found, and it gives you an idea of yachts, fishing boats, etc., etc. In England, it's slightly different, where marinas tend to be away from this lot. The rest of the world have all of this lot mixed in together. Okay, visibility obviously makes a huge difference to your pilotage. Can you see where the hell you're going? And or is it going to be day or night when you have to leave? Are you going to be arriving at nighttime? Are you going to be leaving at nighttime because of the tide? Okay, you need to know the local regulations of where you're leaving. What is the harbor's call sign on what channel? And the same thing again for re-entering a harbor and or any safe havens. There's nothing worse than a harbor master getting on the radio to you and saying, pull in, you're not obeying my rules, you're not allowed to leave, because you haven't called them. Okay, and as I said, day or night. Now, with planning, your tide and the day you want to leave might force you to leave at night or in the early hours of the morning. It also might be the reverse, where you want to arrive in daylight because you're going into a port you don't know. So you would rather leave the port you knowing at nighttime to make sure you arrive at the other end during the day. Okay, the legalities. Okay, so now you're going across to France and you're taking 2 South Africans with you. They will have to enter France with passport control. The fact that the English can just go in and out without a problem, or the Irish for that matter, not a problem, but you take a South African with you, you've got to know the legalities of passport control. Don't have someone come down to your boat and say, what's going on here, and get 2 of your crew arrested. They won't be well pleased with you. You must obviously know what their local emergency numbers are and their VHF channels. Have them handy, have them ready to go. Something happens going in or out of a port, you don't want to be running around going, what's the RLNI's number? What channel are they on? What do I call? You want them literally handy on your plan. Okay, and then obviously you want to do a safe route. Okay, now when you get to doing a pilotage for real, I actually scribble it on a piece of paper and have it in my pocket on deck. something like that, going from this buoy to that buoy, this bearing to that bearing. That's exactly sort of what I want to do. And I will bring myself in along buoys like this with notes. Okay. A pilot plan should be made before entering or exiting any port. That's fairly obvious. It might well be done through general knowledge or a common port of use. So when we go in and out of Portsmouth, like the photograph is, that's Portsmouth Harbour, I know all those numbers off by heart. I know the route off by heart, and I just check the tide in the morning before we go. Okay, I know where the ferries go and all that sort of thing. I don't need to write it out every time, but I'll check my tide and I'll call the port control and all that sort of thing. So you're actually doing a pilotage plan without writing it out. Okay, unknown ports, you would be very unwise not to do one. Okay, things can go wrong very quickly in a port. If you're on a lee shore with a bit of tide, you can be on that shore before you know, you even get a chance to get an anchor out to stop you. Okay, unknown ports, it is really unwise not to do a proper pilotage for entry and exit. This is a common sight, by the way, in Cape Town. There's a current that comes out of the harbour and it sticks the guys on this beach here very quickly. It's not uncommon. And the tugs come out, pull them off, and off they go again, because the southeaster just pins them there. Common pilotage errors. Getting your tide wrong, your tidal stream wrong, or your tidal depth wrong. Either one of those two can put you in trouble very quickly. You get washed onto rocks, you get washed onto walls, etc. Incorrect radio procedures. Okay, harbors really get annoyed. They see yachts most of the world over. They see yachts as a pain in the butt, but they can't stop them. Recreational craft to them are a pain in the butt. We don't pay for harbor entry. We don't pay for mooring other than directly to the yacht club. Ships coming in pay them $10,000 a day. You know, they're happy with them, and they speak to them and they move them around. With us, we're a pain. It's not uncommon for a harbor master to turn around and say, whatever your name is, vessel, return to your mooring, you're getting a fine. And they'll chain you to dock until your fine's paid. It's not uncommon. And getting lost. It's a favorite in big harbors. If you look at this photograph, there's the sea out here. You've got to come through all these different gates and areas to make it to this marina. How easy would it be just go that way at night? Or you come in, you turn early and you miss the marina altogether. You getting lost is a very, very big favorite. And then you end up in this marina when you're supposed to be in the one over there. You know, if you haven't done your pilotage, you're likely to get lost in big harbors. Favorite, go up the Hudson River and try and find your marina up there without doing pilotage. I presume you all know the Hudson River's in New York, or go into Chesapeake Bay and you're looking for a specific marina. Well, you've got to choose between one and the 1,490 marinas that are there. So you really need to know where you're going. Getting lost in Chesapeake Bay as well doesn't help because it's got lots of shallows. Okay, the nav. What considerations do we have for nav in passage planning? Obviously, first and foremost is our weather. If we're going to go across to France, remember we've had this comment already, what weather are you going to do? You're going to go for the nice weather and you're going to make sure you do it. Your weather is your first consideration before you even consider a passage. You want to look at a forecast for a short and a long range for fairly obvious reasons. With ocean crossings, you need to take special attention to annular effects like TRSs, which is tropical revolving storms, which hurricanes, typhoons, tornadoes, things like that, and other extreme conditions. Some of you seen southerly busters. It's a time of year thing. Hurricanes in the Atlantic are a time of year thing. So you want to make sure you're not going to be doing the Atlantic during hurricane season. The other thing is, with your forecasts, you can be doing the English Channel and there's no wind. It is just as much of a problem. Now you're bobbing out there, you haven't quite got enough fuel to motor the whole way, and you're sitting there. So no wind can be just as much of a problem as too much wind. In fact, it's more of a problem because with lots of wind, you can still reef down like this boat here and then just keep sailing. Remember, we're working off forecasts. So your plan can change, might have to change. You're supposed to be a nice downwind leg and it's ending up being a lot of beating and into the wind. You're not going to make the boat speed you had originally planned. So be flexible. You're working on a forecast, not a fact. Okay, so weather, that was the first one. Hazards. You need to know where all your hazards are. You need to know what they are and where they are. Types of hazards, well, TSSs, traffic separation zones, we've spoken about them in coal rigs, those purple things, and also marine traffic. Are there marine traffic routes where big ships are coming through all the time? Is there a harbor entrance that's going to have lots of traffic? Is there a place where these cruise liners tie up and you're going to have lots of them coming through? You know, offshore installations, well, obviously you don't want to bump into those. Ask Nick Leggett. During the one Cape to Rio, his rudder snapped off and he literally bumped into an oil rig with his yacht. He went dying against the side of it. Farms, fish farms. There's more and more and more of them appearing. Those who went in and out of London, there's lots of them there. There's offshore installations and there's fish farms. Going into first the Portugal port, our first port, Portimao. There was a huge fish farm just outside where we came in. We had to avoid it. And obviously islands, you know, you don't want to bump land. Islands, rocks, all that sort of thing, you know. So you need to know where all your hazards are from a passage planning point of view, from a navigation point of view, simply so you can go around them. Tide. Here's the Isle of Wight. Here's France. We're going to go down to Cannes or Eastrum or one of these places down here. So we jump on and we point there. The tide's flowing that way. We're going to end up over here somewhere. You've got to know what your tide is doing. It can shorten or lengthen your trip considerably. You're coming from Falmouth and you're going back this way. You're going with the tide the whole way. You're going to be adding some nice speed to your speed over ground. If you're going from this side that way, you don't want to be punching tide the whole way. Okay, that tide comes back to, do you remember this slide, our course to steer? So there's a 5-hour course to steer with tide. That's our course to steer. We arced it off and it gave us a nice angle across the channel. Tide going that way, turns around, tide coming this way. So your course to steer, you would then calculate, you can do them hourly, you don't have to do a 5-hour one, or you can do them in a nice long one like this if you're doing a long straight. So if I go back again, you could do a course to steer from there to there, 60-mile trip. So you're going to do a 5-hour tide there and back, and you've got a course to steer there, which means you'll actually sail probably something like that, but you'll end up in the right place and you've calculated it. Because as you sail along, the tide will die and then the tide will come from the other side. But effectively, you're doing the straightest possible course with that. Okay, as you get bigger, you've got to take rhumb lines and great circle lines into account. Okay, remember your charts are flattened pieces of the world. Okay, so here you can see from New York to Madrid. If you go straight across on a chart, it's a hell of a lot longer, almost 200 miles longer than if you curve with the Earth, because your chart is a flattened ideal of the world. So if we just look at very, very briefly, Mercator and Nomic charts. Mercator charts are the ones we use, which are flat, and our grid system is square, whereas Nomic charts, the grid system, as you see here, are curved. So you take that same rhumb line and you put it onto a Nomic chart, that's what it looks like. So therefore your great circle route is quicker, but that's a topic all on its own, but it does need to be taken into account when you're doing long trips, because it makes a big difference in time. That's a whole day sailing. Okay, let's have a couple of quizzes. Our tides, to know our emergency contacts, to know as much as possible out of port before entry or exit, or A, B, or C. What should I think about when passage planning? You can list a bunch of ideas. Thirdly, do you have to follow a passage plan? Always, sometimes, if possible, and not really. Okay, first one, I would have accepted both C and D in an exam, okay, because obviously these two fall under C. A, B, and C would have been a better answer, but it's basically to go into a port and out of a port with as much knowledge as possible. Okay, so, I mean, I've literally put down a huge list of things that you can think about when passage planning here. Weather, navigation, pilotage, water, fuel, food, clothing, spares, first aid, emergency aid, bedding, crew, safe havens. All these things, you can literally keep going and going on this list. So it's, the reason I put that question in is, what is an incredibly good idea is to make lists. Get a pen and paper. In fact, my passage plan list is actually on my desk somewhere. There it is. If you look at the screen, I keep a notebook like this in my pocket all the time, and I keep my notes for every passage on there. So it's with me. So I can tick box lists before I leave dock. So that's actually why I put that question in there. Okay, do you have to follow a passage plan? No, you don't, but you do it as much as possible. Remember, we have to be adaptable. Forecasts changed. We wanted to leave dock at 0600 in the morning, but then a ship came in trouble and we couldn't leave until 7. How does that affect our plans? Can we be adaptable with that? Does it affect our finishing tide? All that sort of thing. Okay, we get to the other end and they say that the port is dredged to this depth and it's not. Do we have to anchor outside? We have to be adaptable. But we want to try and follow it as much as possible, but we need to be adaptable with a passage plan. They're not a hard and fast must follow, because weather changes, routes change. You might have to detour for an injury. Okay, victualling. Victualling. There we go. There's a pile of food packed out and daily ready to go to packs. Water, fuel, food, clothing, spares, first aid, emergency bedding, personal. Okay, and you can keep going with that. So these are food packs. There's a day's food for whatever we had on board. Oops, gone too far, sorry. Water. Are we carrying or can we make enough water for our planned passage? Those who were in Early Beach this year, you remember the disaster of trying to leave the dock because some of the boats, water makers, weren't reliable. And we were trying to get water on board all the boats. Okay. Fresh water is your most important thing on board. And that doesn't mean to say you want to take a shower every day. It's just drinking water. Without it, you don't survive. There is no water out there. You can't use the salt water. Okay? Are we carrying it? Making it? And if we're not, where can we replenish? Where do we do a stop to replenish for fresh water? Never chance fresh water. Make sure you replenish. Okay? So, know exactly how much you've got on board. And remember, most yacht tanks are rounded. So if you stick a hose in there and you fill this tank, you don't know how many liters you put in. If you're using a tank for the first time, pour it in at 10 or 20 liters a time until it fills, and you can say that tank contains 45 liters, 200 liters, whatever it is. A hose doesn't give you an amount of liquid that you put in. It just fills it for you. Okay, so the first time you use a tank, if you try to calculate it by going, that's my depth, that's my length, and that's my breadth, it's not going to give you an accurate figure because it's curved. So you need to know, even if you can measure that, that, and that, it's not going to give you square figure unless you want to start working heavy trigonometry calculations. It's easier just to pour in 5 liters at a time. You have your hose there with a 5-liter jug. One's being poured in, one's being filled by a hose. And you can count it in by the liter. Know exactly how many liters you've got. Fuel. Okay. It gives you power. Most vessels, whether it's a generator or whether it's the actual main engine powering up your 12, 24-volt bank, fuel is very, very important, especially if you have an emergency. You can't do a man overboard under power without your diesel. Okay. One of the things we do with Clipper is we actually keep a certain percentage of our fuel specifically for that, in case we have to do. Now, if you think of a man overboard in the middle of where we practice, it's nice and easy. It takes us 20 minutes. If you're doing it offshore in the middle of the English Channel, you could be motoring around for 2-3 hours trying to get that person in. You might also then be motoring flat out to try and get them medical attention. Don't underestimate how much fuel you've got. Know your liters per hour. If I'm running at 6 knots, I'm going to use 2 liters an hour. So you can calculate it. Know what your boat does. It's very easy to do before a passage. You fill your tank, you go and motor flat out at 6 knots in like for an hour, come back, fill your tank again, you know how much fuel you've used. Okay, do you plan on motoring? You know, when we do the equator crossings with this race, we've got a certain amount of motoring that we plan in. That fuel has to be planned into your trip. Okay, and how long is your pilotage? When we arrive in the States to go to Seattle, there's a 60-mile passage that we've got to go through the lakes before we get to Seattle. How long is your pilotage? How much fuel are you going to need for that? You know, think of leaving London. So we had to have fuel to come all the way down the Thames, and then that's a 30-mile trip before we start again. Okay, food. Food obviously is quite important. Just a couple of pointers on it. Obviously, how many crew have you got? That obviously counts for how much you're loading. Do you have any allergic or allergies? Okay, so do you have to watch, like from anybody on my boat, we can't have mushrooms. I'm allergic to it. Just in case somebody does put mushrooms in by mistake, I don't particularly want anaphylactic shock. So we have no mushrooms on Bermuda. It might be, I know Jeff with his peanut thing, we've got some on board, but we literally separate even the knives. The knives used for peanut butter is on the other side of the galley, you know. Perhaps with some people it's so allergic reaction that we can't take peanut butter because they're peanut. So be aware of it. A number of days planned. Obviously you want to know that. Your storage ability. How much cold storage have you got? How much fresh stuff can you take? Meats, frozen meats, etc. Okay, measure it out. Make sure you know exactly how much is in there. I can put in 45 liters of frozen stuff. That's it. And then for your hippies and your vegetarians, you've got to make special stuff. Sorry, Jason. You were very, very, very understanding of being a vegetarian. You were really good about it. But, you know, are there special dietary needs is really what that should say. Okay. Clothing, very important. Always plan for the worst. The amount of people I've seen, oh, we're just going to France, it's a beautiful day, we'll be there in 6 hours. Halfway across, they are shivering like a mad thing because they got wet. Always plan for the worst. Take your foul weather gear no matter what you do. But have various options. Okay, there's a crew in completely various conditions. There's some with long sleeves, some with short sleeves, and some with no sleeves. Okay, remember salt water doesn't dry easily. So have backup. Have backup clothing. Spares. Guaranteed things will break. 100% guaranteed. I have never done a passage anywhere of any length of time that things didn't break. How many times have we sewn, riveted, drilled on Bermuda? I don't know. Okay, things will break. So what spares to take? This is generally what I carry. Rigging spares. That includes, if you look at the little box here of mine, that includes rivets to hold bits to the mast. Obviously sail spares, sewing, etc. Engine and generator spares, highly important. Remember, that's your power. Water maker spares, that's your water. Lines, and I'm talking about ropes, okay? Spare halyard for your main. Spare sheets, that sort of thing. Sewing spares for your sails, obviously. Blocks, these things. Massively important. For block blows, you can't fix it if its pieces are gone flying over the side. And you can keep going. Okay. Nuts, screws, stainless, make sure it's all stainless. First aid, it's obviously dependent on the trip. Completely dependent on the trip. However, do you have any specific crew needs? Is somebody on some sort of heart pills? Is there somebody on board that is diabetic? Do you need to carry additional insulin? Make sure you know what your crew is before you put a first aid kit together. Also, what's the knowledge of the first aider? Can your first aider give stitches? Or if he can't, what's the point in carrying them? You know, so know the knowledge of your first aider. Okay, and highly important, remember drugs expire. Keep an eye on your first aid kit. There's no point in giving somebody some top-notch painkillers if they've expired and don't do anything. Worse off, you give them something that's expired and there's a reaction to it. Okay, here's a top tip. Keep a first aid log. so you know what was used and can be replaced. Make sure you're the one that issues it, and you can write in the logbook and say, okay, I used X, Y, and Z. When I get into the next port, I must replace X, Y, and Z to make sure it's complete. If your crew help themselves to first aid, you don't know what has left the box. You don't know what to replace. Okay, emergency aid, that's things like your stretcher boards. That's dependent on your length and your crew. Bedding. Now, the reason I put that in there is people underestimate the importance of sleeping offshore. Okay. You go offshore and you take your nice down duvet, and the first bit of water that gets into that down duvet, I can see Tristan shaking his head. It becomes useless. Okay. Know your materials, make sure your crew have got the right bedding. If you're asking them to go on watch for 3 hours or 4 hours and they've had zero sleep because their bed is soaking wet and they're freezing, they're not going to be useful crew. That's why I put bedding in there. Personal gear. Okay, just a few things that I'm pointing out. I'm not talking about the amount of clothes that we need to carry. Medical prescriptions. Enough for your trip, okay? Plus enough to put into the grab bag for the life raft. You don't want to be looking for heart pills when the boat needs to be going to a life raft. You need spare if they are life-giving in the grab bag already for the life raft. And secondly, for international trips, you must have prescriptions. Okay, if somebody checks your drug supply and says, oh, hang on a second, you're carrying all these Class A drugs, where's your prescription? And you can't provide it, you can get in a lot of trouble. With the Clipper guys, we don't have to worry about it, particularly because they clear all that sort of thing before we get there. They supply the various ports and the various port authorities with, these are our first aid kits, this is what we're carrying. So there's no problem with us. A favor to forget, sunblock. Even in an English Channel crossing, you can still get really nicely burnt. So those are just some that I'm just thrown in. Okay, when you are victualling, always have a backup or a run over. So if you're going to go to sea for a month, make sure you take food for 40 days or 35 at minimum. I work on a 10% because sailing is inaccurate science. We don't know exactly when we're going to get there. I work on a 10% leeway all the time. For food, fuel, and water. Okay, very quickly, safe havens. It's an additional port that's not on your plan, and it's an in case of injury. It's a foul weather port that you can get out of foul weather. If you have a breakage, you can go in there and do a repair or any additional emergency. Okay. We've had a couple of boats our race so far that have had to do stops. Ian had to go to Durban to go and drop off somebody who had an appendicitis. Do you remember? On UNICEF. He had to go all the way up to Durban. Okay, so that's our plan. We're going to travel from the Isle of Wight down to Falmouth. Where will we put our safe havens? Well, the 3 biggest ports. You know, we would look at safe havens. Okay. We're en route. If you're here, probably quicker to go that way. If you're here, to go back. But it also gives me tidal options. If the tide's flowing that way, it might be quicker to turn and go there than punch the tide there. So you're looking at your options, where and what the tide is doing. If you're coming this way, well, you'd find it would be quicker just to keep going straight or keep going north or south, because there is nothing out here. Okay, what sort of port? Easy access. Make sure there's no tidal restrictions. So in this case, there's a lock. You can come in, go into the lock, and you can get into the marina. Okay. Make sure there's good medical assistance. Okay. There's no point in saying, okay, well, we're going to stop at the Kerguelen Islands because it's en route when we're doing the Southern Ocean. Well, there's no medical assistance there, so it's not a viable safe haven port. Easy landing facilities. Okay, this is the Island Sailing Club on Medina River. It's where we threw Big Dick off to go and get his thumb patched up after he had chomped it in a primary winch. If you've got somebody with a broken leg, you don't want to be on a swing mooring out there and trying to load them in and out of a ferry boat and then bring them across and then load them in and out again. You want nice, easy landing facilities. Nav logs. Okay, simply a ship's log or a log is an important events management operation navigation at sea. That's all it is. Okay, the record can be referred to by any governing authority as to the vessel's passage and is considered a legal document. Okay, this is a legal document. Therefore, it is your defense if something goes wrong. Why did the boat fall over? Well, I had the right sail plan, I had the right crew on deck, the watch system was working, there's my proof, there's my logbook. Okay, now you're over canvassed and you've got a big problem. They look at the logbook and they say, well, what are you doing sailing with a full main and a Yankee 1 in 60 knots of wind? And they will question it. It's written in the log, isn't it? It's a legal document that they can use in any inquiry. Okay, therefore entries should be made in black ink and in neat, legible handwriting. You don't know who's going to be reading it. Okay, quick quiz. What would you look for in a safe haven? Let's have some ideas. Why is a logbook? So the three that I look for most when we're looking at a safe haven: easy access, is there good medical support, and is it easy mooring facilities? Those are the three most important things for me. Easy access, meaning I can get in there with ease, with tide, no problem. Good medical support, yep, they've got an ambulance service. And easy mooring facilities. 9 times out of 10, you'll find with easy mooring facilities and good medical support, you will also find physical support for the boat. So if you've broken something, you can often find spares. Okay. The reason you fill it in with ink is it cannot be adjusted. It's a legal document. You may not change it later. So if you make an error, and I've specifically put this there, if you make an error in your logbook when you fill it in, just put a line through it, rewrite the line, and just put a signature next to it. It's perfectly acceptable to erase a line with a line through it, and then just rewrite the whole line because you made an error. There's no problem with that. And just countersign it. Okay, now this fuel question. I've put the answer as a minimum 10% extra. Okay. A lot of people, and I've seen it happen numerous times, they go for as much as the boat will hold. They'll fill their tanks and go, okay, we filled our tanks, let's go. They haven't checked how big the tank is. We filled the tanks, we've thrown in a full tank of gas, let's go. And funnily enough, you know, that then becomes a problem. They suddenly realize that there isn't enough fuel in there. Okay, so normal, just scratching the surface. Okay, actual plans can only be really made a couple of days before a passage. You can do a lot of other prelim work, but you haven't got a weather forecast until a couple of days before a passage. you know. So you actually need to do this day or so before you leave. Passage planning will be in your exams, without question. You will write one. Lots of it is common sense, but as I said, it's a good idea to make lists. And keeping up with your log could save your ticket. Okay, when I say just scratching the surface, for instance, I didn't talk about gas for cooking. It's obviously something that goes on a list, you know. I didn't add absolutely everything in there. Again, time constraints. If we had to do gas calculations and all that sort of thing, you know, it starts getting complicated. Next week, we're just going to do restricted visibility, precautions to be taken in it, and the limitations imposed by fog. What limitations are there by fog? And then we'll talk about the marine environment. So coal rigs, rule 19 is restricted visibility, but we'll also expand on it. And MARPOL, they're the ones who do the marine environment. They look after the marine environment. Okay, there's lots of stuff online you can read about it if you want to. Otherwise, you can discuss it next week.